Now when Apple launched the iPhone 12 series, the thing that stood out to me the most, me being a videographer and a content creator, was the Dolby Vision 10-bit HDR capture, playback and editing capabilities of the latest iPhones. And I wanted to see if any other device which was launched earlier and that I could get access to had this 10-bit feature, so I could test it out to see if it was a worthy alternative to buying third-party apps to hopefully get better quality out of your smartphone. And well, to my surprise, I realized that the Samsung Galaxy S10, which I reviewed not too long ago, has had the HDR10 Plus 10-bit H.265 capture mode since the launch of the phone, and I hadn't really looked into it. So I looked this up online to hopefully find some information about this so that I could potentially try this out. But that search was in vain. There was practically next to no coverage about this exact topic, and well, the little coverage there was not perfect and I could not verify or attest to the results. So I went out and I tested on my own all of the recording modes in 10-bit and 8-bit to compare to see if the 10-bit captures is actually a legitimate feature and not a gimmick in the latest Samsung flagships. Before we get into the comparison, we have to first understand what is 10-bit, what is HDR, and why does it matter. So now consumer video, that is the video to which we all have access to, the video produced by the cameras, the phones we have and the webcams and all the other devices which we could access, they're all 8-bit files. Now, video as a whole is a bunch of still frames, but if it was just that, then the file sizes will be huge because each JPEG is about 5 megabytes. So if you wanted to store 30 JPEGs in 1 second, it will add up to terabytes and terabytes of data. So we have to figure out a way to transmit files efficiently and as quickly as possible. Now, one way of compressing files is to not record all the colors present in a scene and only record the adequate amount, the perfect amount through which we can perceive reality. And through experiments, we realized that 8-bit files, 8-bit having 256 different color values for each single channel, red, green and blue, was the perfect choice. It could represent any scene you throw at it with relative ease and it will look real. It will not look pastel or it will not be overkill. It is the perfect balance and it works for consumer video where you hit record, you do the recording and then you share it with other people and consume it. But for people like us who like to tweak the colors, the 8-bit file just doesn't have enough information in it for us to tweak the said information. So that is why in prosumer level cameras, there are 10-bit file capture modes. 10-bit meaning it has 1024 color values for each single channel, red, green and blue. So this 1024 color values is a 4-fold increase and it provides us that much more data to work with so that we can grade the images the way we want. Now the cheapest 10-bit cameras on the market here in India are upwards of 1 lakh. So it is still a very niche thing and not everybody has access to 10-bit files. But the very fact that smartphones like these, although they are expensive in their own right, have the capability of shooting 10-bit files is very commendable. So now I wanted to find out whether the 10-bit capture modes are just a gimmick or an actual feature on these phones. I devised up a test. It is not the most scientifically accurate test, but it is one nonetheless, where I would capture a scene back to back with varying exposure levels and varying color depths to see which was the best combination and which you could use if you had this phone or any other comparable Samsung flagship to hopefully get the best video quality out of it, or as a stock camera application. Shooting 10-bit on Samsung phones have a bunch of caveats, especially this S10. It can only shoot 10-bit files, HDR10 files, in the H.265 or High Efficiency Video Codec, HEVC. And this is very taxing on any system to edit because these files are very compressed and are very efficient, hence the name. So when you're trying to edit this, the CPU has to do that much more work to decompress and to encode the files properly. So editing this will be a pain, but if the image quality is worth it, I am willing to go through this. And also the 10-bit only works in up to 30 frames per second no matter what resolution you pick. So I decided it would be best for me to shoot in 4K 24 frames per second to get the best quality. And also I shot this inside the Pro video mode inside the Samsung Galaxy stock camera application so as to give these files the best chance of looking beautiful. I decided to shoot a bunch of files, both 10-bit and 8-bit with varying exposure levels. The first being, according to the phone's metering, perfectly exposed or zero stops exposure compensation. I shot this both in 10-bit and 8-bit. and then I proceeded to overexpose the image by one stop in both 10-bit and 8-bit and capture that, overexpose it by 2 stops and capture that. This was in an effort to see how well the phone retains the highlights. And I did the same for shadows, where I underexposed the files by 1 stop and 2 stops to check which one retained information in the shadows. Now upon testing, the thing I realized was the 10-bit files do not receive the in-camera sharpening, which was almost enough to convince me to use 10-bit, because in-camera sharpening looks ugly and you can always add sharpening. So I could shoot 10-bit and make it look like 8-bit, but I cannot remove the sharpening from the 8-bit file to make it look like the 10-bit file. So this was almost enough to convince me to shoot in 10-bit, but I really wanted to see how well this codec performed. So I did shoot in all of these settings and all of these exposure values in both 10-bit and 8-bit to see which one was better. So upon importing these files, the 10-bit files, into Premiere Pro, I realized that Premiere Pro did not recognize the HDR metadata in these files, and what I got was a horribly overexposed, very much contrasty and too crunchy of an image. I tried to spend hours on this to get Premiere Pro to recognize the HDR metadata, but it simply wouldn't. There was no way of me telling Premiere Pro that these are HDR files and that the brightness that these have are close to 1000 nits. But Premiere Pro simply wouldn't recognize, so I was about to give up on this video. But upon tweaking in the Lumetri color panel, I realized that Premiere Pro does not clip the highlights above 100% exposure in 8-bit. So I was able to bring back the highlights and boost the shadows to a considerable level where the file looked proper. So upon doing this, I realized that the 10-bit files have so much more information retained within them so that they would withstand that much more grading. I mean, 10-bit files are designed to be graded heavily, they just have more information to begin with. So starting with the 0 exposure files, both the 8-bit and 10-bit files handled the color grading okay. The highlights were adequately retained in the 8-bit and the shadows were okay, but they had a bit of noise which was visible, so I wouldn't push it. I wouldn't increase the shadows too much. You would introduce noise. And the 8-bit files also had a lot of in-camera sharpening, which made these files look terrible. Now the 10-bit files just had so much more information. It did not have the in-camera sharpening, and it also had a lot of highlight and shadow information left, so I could potentially tweak the exposure after the fact during post-production to change the look of a scene. Now going to the +1 overexposed image, the 10-bit file was just perfect. The overexposure made so that the little bit of shadow noise was completely eliminated and the highlights were retained perfectly, so that you don't notice that this file was actually overexposed. But I can't say the same about the 8-bit file. The 8-bit file, once I brought back the exposure down to 0, you could tell that it was overexposed and I tried to bring it back. The highlights had that characteristic look where it was clipped and you tried to bring the information back. And the shadows, but in this case, were also cleaned up because you actually shot the shadows at a higher luminance range and you're bringing it down. So the shadows got cleaned up, but the highlights look terrible. So if you're having a scene where you don't have that much dynamic range and most of the information you require are in the shadows and you are shooting 8-bit, I'd suggest you overexpose the image by half a stop so that you can bring it back down during editing and get rid of most of the noise. But again, the 8-bit files also had the terrible in-camera sharpening, making these files look garbage. Now going for the -1 underexposed, one stop underexposed file, this file was also again amazing in 10-bit, with the highlights being produced perfectly and the shadows also having considerable amount of detail. Now in the underexposed file, the shadows had a bit of noise when you bring them back up to the normal range, but it is all fine and you can easily remove it with the denoising plugin. But I can't say the same about the 8-bit file. Now the 8-bit file again retained the highlight information perfectly. I could expose the sky the way I wanted, but the shadows again got a considerable amount of noise wherein it was distracting. And any detail, any information present in the shadows just wasn't sharp enough because of the noise in the shadows. And also this had the in-camera sharpening again, making these files look terrible. Now going to the +2 stop overexposed file, the 10-bit file started showing artifacts of exposure change, the characteristic clipped highlights. You could see a halo around high contrast areas, that is, if there is a very bright region surrounding a very dark region, there'd be a halo around the darker region because the pixels on the very edge of the dark region haven't completely clipped. But if you can avoid high contrast areas, the +2 stop overexposed 10-bit file is also pretty good. The shadows are pretty much cleaned up. You have zero noise in the shadows, and the highlights have a bit of artifacting, but it can be avoidable, and it can be avoided and can be corrected, but there are certain artifacts in the highlights. 8-bit file is completely gone. There is practically next to no highlight information, but the shadows are clean though. But there's also a terrible in-camera sharpening. So I would never recommend you overexpose by 2 stops or underexpose by 2 stops on 8-bit files, because the files simply don't have the information required for you to bring it back and for it to look good. Now going to the 2-stop underexposed file, it was again not so good in both 8-bit and 10-bit. The 10-bit file had a considerable amount of noise in the shadows now because we're bringing it up so much, but the highlights were perfectly retained and they looked beautiful. And the shadows in the 2-stop underexposed 10-bit file can be compared to the 1-stop underexposed 8-bit file, meaning it is there, you start to not care about it. It is in the range where the shadows, noise, it's passable and you can let it go, but the 8-bit file, however, is a totally different story. The highlights are again perfectly retained and they look amazing, but the midtones and the shadows simply have no information in them for me to bring it back and make it look properly. And the little more of detail left in the shadows are completely gone. It is all nothing but a blocky, pixely mess, and the in-camera sharpening makes this worse. So what I've concluded from my testing is that overexposing your 10-bit files by 1 stop is the best way you can capture the best footage from your smart Samsung Galaxy flagships. And well, shooting in 10-bit in general is better. You don't get the in-camera sharpening and you get a file that can withstand that much more color grading, meaning it has that much more information. So if you want to get the best picture quality out of your Samsung phones, especially flagships, shoot 10-bit if you have the option to, and overexpose the scene by 1 stop if you have the flexibility to. And regarding the 8-bit files, it is terribly over-sharpened, and if your phone does not have the 10-bit option, I would unfortunately have to suggest you look into another solution like buying third-party camera apps like Filmic Pro or other equivalents. So that was it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. And yes, thank you for the 200 subscribers. I'll see you guys next month with a new video.